It's rare that a journalist becomes the story rather than the one telling the story, but over the last year, one man's name has made headline news around the world.
Russia's security agency says it has arrested a US journalist working for the Wall Street Journal in Moscow on charges of espionage.
Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal was detained by intelligence agents yesterday while reporting in central Russia.
In a statement, the Wall Street Journal said, "We seek the immediate release of our trusted and dedicated reporter, Evan Gershkovich."
On the 29th of March 2023, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was on a field trip in the Ural mountains of Russia when he was arrested on spurious charges of espionage. His boss, Moscow bureau chief Ann Simmons, immediately knew something was up.
I was in Moscow and Evan was on a reporting assignment in the Ural city of Yekaterinburg. He was expected to check in with our global security team at certain times of the day, as we all are when we're out on assignment. And basically, when he missed his scheduled check-in, we knew something was wrong. Not long after, I know I saw, and several other of my colleagues saw footage on social media of someone that looked like Evan. The individual had Evan's coat thrown over his head, and this person was being escorted out of the building. So that, of course, immediately kind of triggered an alarm.
Russia's security service, the FSB, a successor to the Soviet-era KGB, had accused Evan of attempting to obtain classified information about a military-industrial complex, charging him with espionage. Charges the Journal, the US government, and Evan's family categorically deny. I'm Nicola Kelly, and this is Silenced. Today, the case of the first foreign correspondent to face charges of spying on Russia since the Cold War. What lies ahead for Evan Gershkovich and all those trying to get reliable, impartial information out of the country? For Anne and all her team in the Moscow bureau, seeing those first images of Evan emerging on social media came as an enormous shock.
Well, I know that my heart sank when I first saw that, because then I knew, of course, gosh, something's terribly wrong here. I cannot, unfortunately, get into the details of specific protocols. What I can say is that when Evan missed his scheduled check-in, that triggered an alarm. And the mechanism can vary, but the Journal has a very sophisticated system surrounding the security of its journalists. And in a nutshell, the global security team would have taken over in terms of our protocol in dealing with this issue.
And had there been any precedent for anything like that, or did it come as a complete surprise to you and your team?
Well, it certainly came as a surprise to my team and I, because Evan was based in Russia as a journalist, an accredited journalist, which means he had permission to work there from the Foreign Ministry of Russia. And the team, Evan, we all followed the rules and regulations of the law there, all the rules and regulations that Russia sets down for foreign correspondents. Having accreditation obviously isn't foolproof, but we do know that we are allowed to travel around the country and report on stories. And so, of course, this came as a surprise that any one of us would be detained for simply practicing journalism. Obviously, Evan's detention had a very large impact on the Bureau, on all of us, because he wasn't just a journalist in the office, he was a colleague and a friend.
The day after Evan was arrested, Anne was pulled out of Russia. Over the next few months, the Wall Street Journal's Moscow bureau was closed down, forcing the team to work remotely from outside the country. The paper now had no footprint, no physical presence in Russia. How does a reporter cover a beat as complex and fast-moving as this one without being there to bear witness?
I think it does make it a lot harder to tell the Russia story simply because you don't have boots on the ground. It's still possible, and this is what many Western organizations, including the Wall Street Journal, are doing. They're reporting from outside. What it boils down to is having really good sourcing on the ground in Russia, which we do have. It's being able to still connect with Russian authorities, with the Kremlin, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And of course, we still do that. We always seek comment for stories where appropriate. But it does make it a lot harder. It makes it harder also because Russians in general have been told that they should not be speaking to journalists, much less foreign press, and particularly foreign press that is considered by the Russian government to be what they call unfriendly nations. And that basically means Western nations that do not back Russia's military campaign in Ukraine. So yes, it certainly does take away from the reporting. That's not to say, though, that it's not possible to cover Russia. It just makes it a lot more difficult.
And are you more reliant on local reporters now, reporters that are still inside Russia?
What I can say about that is that we're more reliant on the sources that we have on the ground there. It really is about the kind of sources we've cultivated over the years. It's about the analysts and the experts who still remain there, and also people outside who follow Russia every day and understand the intricacies of this society. So yes, we are dependent on people who are inside Russia because they are essentially our eyes and ears.
While some international media organisations have kept their Moscow bureaus open, their reporters have had to be cautious about how they approach certain topics that are sensitive to the Kremlin.
What a lot of foreign news organizations have done is that they have relocated their bureaus outside of Russia, but their correspondents travel in and out as long as they still have accreditation from the Russian Foreign Ministry. And there are still journalists permanently based there. For example, Steve Rosenberg, our esteemed colleague of the BBC. So there are still people on the ground there from Western news organizations.
Has it heightened the sort of fear or concern from those journalists who do still travel back into Russia that the same could happen to them?
I think absolutely. And it has heightened concern on the part of foreign journalists now going in and out of Russia, trying to cover the story. And I think immediately after Evan's detention, there was an exodus. Western press or Western media, several of these organizations have trickled back or have again started to allow their correspondents to go in and out. But they know that they do it at a risk. You know, they have to work, as we all do, within the parameters of what the Russian government has set. And, it's arbitrary. Anyone can be picked up, as we've seen in the case of Evan, because, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just doing his job.
Evan's arrest had come at a time of significant friction in Russia's domestic and foreign policy. The ongoing war in Ukraine, the death of Evgeny Prigozhin, all topics Evan and his colleagues had been covering.
Before he was detained, he wrote accounts of the Kremlin's war effort, the toll of the war on Russia and on ordinary people, including dissidents. He wrote about rising tensions between the Kremlin elite and the late leader of the Wagner paramilitary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin. And he also wrote about the mounting death toll. Being of Russian heritage, he was able and is able to understand kind of the subtle nuances of Russian culture. And one story that was particularly compelling for a lot of our readers was a story about the fact that life just continued as normal in Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. So in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, well after the start of the war, restaurants were open, there were crowds sitting at tables, crowds of customers, and the store shelves were also fully stocked. And that really grabbed readers. So Evan was and is a really good reporter, good at seeing details and colour. And you can tell from Evan's stories that he's a field reporter. He wants to tell his stories from the ground.
What kinds of risks does a field reporter take in Russia? And how aware of those risks was Evan before he was detained?
The risks are really very real. And not just for Evan, obviously, but for all reporters based in Russia now, in terms of trying to report from the ground. Reporters can be harassed while out reporting on a sensitive story, especially now because the environment is so negative towards foreign reporters. And the fact that, senior government officials and pro-Kremlin pundits basically accuse Western journalists of trying to denigrate Russia and portray the country in a negative light, that makes it really tough when you're trying to just do objective reporting. The Kremlin insists, and Russian authorities insist, that you basically tell their version of events. They don't want you to go outside and report elsewhere or give details that the Kremlin or Russian authorities haven't revealed. And there can be many pitfalls also when it comes to cultivating new sources, because you never know in the current climate whether people really want to share legitimate information or might be trying to entrap you somehow. You've also got to be quite vigilant when it comes to speaking on the phone. You typically, work under the assumption that your digital correspondence is monitored, and foreign correspondents working on the ground in Moscow and in Russia overall are often followed on assignment. And so, of course, there's always a risk, not only to you, but to the interviewee, to the source to whom you're speaking, because, of course, you want to speak openly to people, but you also know that if people speak to you, that can also put them at grave risk. So there are extreme challenges, and journalists who work in Russia today are definitely acutely aware of those challenges.
Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, the situation has become even more dangerous for reporters.
In this current climate, it's very much like navigating a minefield. The government wants you to stick to its version of events. Russian authorities don't want reporters to call the war a war, for example. And, you risk being fined or deported or, at worst, of course, prosecuted and detained for going against the government's narrative. So this is really hard. It's made it really challenging to be able to report from the ground in Russia.
Is it frustrating at times? I imagine with all the sort of censorship in terms of the, as you say, the language that you are and aren't allowed to use and what you can and can't say, being sort of, being constantly monitored and tracked. It must be frustrating at times to go about this beat.
I would say it's more kind of an endeavor. It's frustrating, yes, but also just really challenging. It's what we signed up for if you're a journalist in the field, and it's particularly if you're a journalist who has taken on covering Russia, you kind of know that it goes with the territory. Because I would say that even before Russia invaded Ukraine, it was challenging to report in Russia. There is a system there that, journalists aren't always trusted, whether or not you're a foreign journalist. People do not trust each other, I would say. And the level of fear and mistrust is palpable.
Anne has been covering Russia for decades. She's seen the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of Putin, conflicts, mutinies, and just about everything in between.
I actually was a student in Moscow in the early 1980s during the Cold War and during the Soviet Union when Russia was building socialism. I returned in the early 1990s as a reporter for Time magazine. The demise of the Soviet Union, the rise of Boris Yeltsin. I was there for all of those years.
Wow. Fascinating time to be there.
Right. So it's certainly a country I know and have watched evolve.
Anne covered many stories during that period, but there's one that particularly sticks out in her mind today.
I think one moment stands out, and that was basically the coup against Gorbachev.
This is the World Service of Radio Moscow. President Gorbachev has declared that he is in full control of the situation.
It was the summer of 1991, and typically nothing much happens in summer in Russia, is what most correspondents will tell you. This summer was different.
Foreign Minister Alexander Besmertnik has declared that the Soviet foreign policy strategy remains unchanged.
I remember that I was there in my apartment, and I actually received a phone call from a fellow colleague at Time magazine based in Los Angeles, which is, I believe, something like an 11-hour time difference. And she was telling me, oh, there's a coup. She had seen it on CNN. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. I was in denial. I said, no, there's no coup. Then I heard tanks rumbling down the street outside, at least a really loud noise. Got up and looked out the window, and there were tanks on the street. And I realized, good Lord, there's probably a coup or some kind of action going on.
Sheila Kast is standing by in Moscow now with a report on this morning's events.
Tanks from the Soviet Army's crack Tamansk and other divisions raced through the streets of Moscow along roads leading to the Kremlin. Armored personnel carriers rolled by, carrying scores of troops, some of them brandishing machine guns. Early in the morning, military vehicles rolled up to Spassky Tower, one of the Kremlin gates. There was no confrontation, but it was a show of military might.
At that particular time, I actually went out, I remember, and spoke to some of those tank drivers who told me they were told just to head to the Russian White House. They had no idea of what they were meant to do. They were just told to go there. Then you saw, just coming out of every crevice, people pouring into the streets. They wanted to know what was going on. There was fear, of course. On Russian television, they were showing Swan Lake, the ballet. They had no indication, of course, that there was a coup.
And now, newsflash. Vice President of the USSR, Gennady Yanayev, took office from Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev because Gorbachev is unable to perform his presidential duties for health reasons.
On radio, they had said that there is now an emergency situation, that Gorbachev had been incapacitated and could no longer run the country, and that there were a group of 6 coup plotters, basically, who were taking over, 6 senior officials of the Communist Party who were going to take over in place of Gorbachev. But I believe that people no longer wanted that. They had already kind of a taste of this openness, and they knew that going backwards was not what they wanted.
Seeing that situation play out on the front lines of history, watching ordinary people put their bodies on the line, was something Ann says she will never forget.
It was watching the Soviet people rise up. No one knew what was happening at the time, but it was the first time that we saw crowds of people taking to the streets. They were not going to take this.
People on the streets were stunned. A few shouted insults at the soldiers. One man lay down in front of a tank to try to halt its progress. Many gathered around tanks, berating the soldiers. One woman shouted angrily, "You are fascists."
And that was remarkable because that could never have happened during the height of the Soviet Union. You know, before Gorbachev, there was just no way that could have happened. And so seeing people stream out onto the streets and, you know, just voice their opinion and say, no, this is wrong and we're not going to stand for this. And seeing people manning the barricades and we're not going to lose our country, that was pretty remarkable.
In response to a Yeltsin call to defend the Russian Federation building, thousands of people took to the streets, defying the ruling committee's decrees, marching past the Kremlin. They built barricades. Bus and truck drivers surrounded the building.
It was also at the time when, Boris Yeltsin, stood up and he was kind of the savior and people really rallied around him. And he would later on become the president of Russia.
It was all too much for Boris Yeltsin. He defied orders to evacuate his offices. He stood upon a tank surrounded by supporters. It is a coup by criminals, said Yeltsin. He called for a general strike across Russia.
Looking back to the 1990s again, when you first started reporting, what was it like? It must have been, it was obviously a fascinating time to be there, but what was it like actually being on the ground and reporting on these issues at the time as a sort of cub reporter, as it were? Was it tricky? Were there as many restrictions in place as there are now?
I think the main restriction was that, yes, of course, you still needed accreditation, But you had to inform the government if you were going to travel 40 kilometers, I believe it was, outside of Moscow. Moscow is where all of the foreign press was based, as is the case today for the most part. And you had to alert them if you were going to travel out. And invariably, you would turn up somewhere and suddenly someone would pop out of the blue as your kind of minder, if you wish. You would know that you were followed around there. It was very, very obvious then. It was also obvious that every phone call was monitored. Every room that you went into was probably bugged, and you worked under that assumption. And it was quite constraining. But the difference was that at least before Gorbachev and before Perestroika and before people realized that, actually, we're now allowed to speak up, it was really difficult to speak to Russians as well, because they had been taught growing up in the Soviet Union that Westerners, and especially Americans or British people, were very much the enemy. They were trying to denigrate Russia. They were trying to undermine Russia. With Gorbachev, this all opened, of course, with glasnost and Perestroika, his policy of openness. And I would give you an example. In the old days, before there was this openness and this policy of glasnost, people would not stop and talk to you. They'd be very wary. Once that came into force, you would stop one person on the street and 10 people would come to try and talk to you, because suddenly everyone had an opinion and they wanted to share it, and they knew they were allowed to do that. So it was really kind of refreshing. It had gone from this extreme repression to this kind of openness where people, of course, cautiously at first, were very encouraged by the fact that now, finally, their country was becoming open.
While it's hard to imagine now, Ann says that the early days of Putin, after he'd taken over from Boris Yeltsin, brought a feeling of hope across Russia that something might be about to change for the better.
The country had regressed economically. The Soviet Union had broken up. Russians were extremely frustrated over the fact that they once were a superpower and no longer were. And Putin came in with this hope, if you wish, that Russia would be modernized, there would be democracy, albeit managed democracy, and this would bring Russia into kind of a new age. But unfortunately, throughout his more than 2 decades in power, we've seen kind of a rollback. As he's become more powerful, he has become more authoritarian, and the Russian people have suffered as a result of that.
Now, any hope that once existed for a more open society under Putin is long gone, something that's particularly clear when you look at how the Kremlin deal with the press.
The government has been clamping down on independent media and on dissent. Several Russian journalists have been detained in recent weeks, for example, on allegations ranging from extremism to discrediting the Russian military. There's basically an attempt to silence even a whisper of criticism or opposition. That makes it very challenging. And again, I want to stress that it's not only against Western journalists or foreign journalists in general, it's also against Russian journalists trying to tell the story of their own country. Russian authorities have blocked websites of news organizations, particularly independent media, because they've been accused of not towing the line. Members of the Russian news media have been harassed, they've had their homes raided, and hundreds of Russian journalists have actually fled the country, as well as those, I should mention, of course, have been prosecuted and detained on allegations and charges such as extremism or discrediting the Russian military.
At the end of June, 15 months on from his arrest, Evan's trial began. It will take place behind closed doors, and he faces up to 20 years in prison should he be found guilty. But his chances for a fair hearing seem remote. In Russia, when a charge comes with support from the Kremlin, hope is dim. And as the New York Times reported, the judge hearing the case has boasted to a local news outlet that in his decades-long career, he has acquitted just 4 defendants. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal, along with Evan's family and friends and his many supporters, have tried to ensure that his case stays in the news to keep eyes on Russia. There have been sponsored runs, posters printed, and interviews focused on the conditions in which he's being held.
there have been a lot of attempts to ensure that Evan is not forgotten. And there have been forums about press freedom in which we highlight Evan's name. The Wall Street Journal has issued badges and posters, and it really has pulled out all of the stops to make sure that Evan's status and his situation isn't forgotten, and that it continues to be known that journalism isn't a crime. And that's what Evan was doing in Russia, practicing journalism.
And in terms of keeping his plight in the headlines, I know Putin has actually referenced it. He said that he would consider Evans's release if certain conditions or terms were agreed and met. And President Biden said he'd been wrongfully detained and the US government would be doing everything it could to secure his release. Sort of looking at the broader context, would you say Evan is being used as a bargaining chip in this sort of geopolitical battle that's being waged between the US and Russia in particular?
What I can say is that the Journal has said that it believes Evan is regrettably being used as a political pawn because he's a journalist and he's completely innocent of the espionage allegation. He was an accredited journalist who received permission from Russian authorities to work in Russia. The US government has said that the charges against Evan are baseless and that Evan has been locked up simply for reporting the news. The ambassador to Russia, the US ambassador to Russia, Lynn Tracy, she has said that when the Kremlin uses lives as bargaining chips, real people suffer. This tells you that the US government believes also that Evan is being used as a bargaining chip. As you've mentioned, the US government has declared Evan wrongfully detained. This is an official designation, and it basically broadens the State Department's authority to exert pressure on Moscow. It can monitor intelligence, it can build diplomatic coalitions, it can fight for regular consular access for Evan, in addition to employing other resources. President Biden, the Biden administration, has promised Evan's family that he's going to bring Evan home. And he has said that bringing Evan home and other US citizens who are wrongfully detained around the world is his number one priority. And that is, of course, very encouraging.
Well, I'm serious about prisoner exchange. I'm serious about doing all we can to free Americans from being illegally held in Russia or anywhere else for that matter. And that process is underway.
What do you know about how he's coping, or what can we tell from the letters that he's been writing about the conditions that he's being held in and his morale, his spirits?
Well, first of all, Evan is being held at Moscow's notorious Lefortovo prison. It's a facility that dates back to the Stalin era. So suffice to say that it appears to have had very little updating, and that's according to Russian lawyers who have had clients held in the prison. Lawyers and also historians who have chronicled Lefortovo prison, this facility, they confirm that it's extremely grim. They describe it as being engineered to keep inmates from ever seeing one another. So in other words, keeping them isolated. And if you've got to endure isolation for a very long period of time, that of course is going to play on your psyche. That of course is going to be very, very hard. As the Journal has reported, Evan is largely cut off from the world. He spends around 90% of his day in a small cell. He's in contact with his lawyers and also has consular access. The US ambassador to Russia goes in to visit him around once a month. And she has said, and we've reported this, that, he's in high spirits. But there's no denying that, being in high spirits in Lefortovo takes work. So we know that Evan has been meditating. He reads a lot. He writes letters. He exercises in his cell. But it's hard. But I've got to say that when we've seen Evan in the courtroom, he's invariably smiling, and he still has that glint, that light in his eye, eyes, and that speaks, I think, to his resilience. So yes, it's tough. He's having, he's in a prison. There's no joy in that, but he's definitely holding up to the best of his ability.
Yeah, it must be heartening to see those moments, to see that his spirits aren't broken and that he's, albeit horrific conditions that he's being held in, that he's sort of, maintaining some sort of semblance of himself. How do you and your staff feel about it all sort of over the last year? You know, what do you tell your staff about Evan and how he's doing?
Well, what I can say is that, of course, this has had a huge impact on all of the journal staff. Colleagues, have just really decided that what they want to do, and that's everyone, it's across the board from New York to the Middle East to Central Europe, all colleagues have really decided that they want to play a role in ensuring that Evan's story isn't forgotten. And also because Evan's story speaks so greatly to the need and the importance of press freedoms. He was detained practicing journalism. That shouldn't happen. And so, of course, it's been discouraging for all of the staff of the Wall Street Journal to have one of its own detained. But it's also been encouraging because we see Evan again smiling, again not broken. And we also know that we're fighting not just for Evan, but for press freedom in general. And I think that certainly helps to keep everyone going.
American Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich appeared in court as his trial began in Russia Wednesday. CBS News correspondent Lilia Luciano reports.
Hey there, Jeff. Good evening. Well, first of all, it's important to remind our audience that he's a journalist, and today he got to see some of his fellow journalists when he appeared briefly inside one of those glass boxes that we've grown used to seeing him in. He got to smile at some of his fellow reporters, but that was pretty much it. They were then shut out of the proceedings because these take place in secret, behind closed doors. No reporters, no observers get to attend, and it is illegal for his attorneys to...
You've been listening to Silenced. I'm Nicola Kelly. The producer was Kevin Caners. This is a podcast series for Article 19.